SMS Von der Tann, Germany's first real attempt at a battlecruiser. The debate about the large armored cruiser SMS Blucher will be put to the side for now. Anyway, Von der Tann, armed with 8 28cm guns and more heavily armored than her contemporaries in the Royal Navy, was commissioned into the High Seas Fleet in September 1910, going on to do several goodwill visits in South America, exercises, and other such activities with the High Seas Fleet until the start of the First World War, in which she participated in a majority of operations with the 1st Scouting Group, including the bombardments of the English coastline, missing the Battle of Dogger Bank, and of course participating in the Battle of Jutland, where she helped to destroy the British battlecruiser Indefatigable and damage other ships during the lengthy battle, sustaining serious damage herself. After the battle, the remainder of the war was relatively uneventful, and like other German Panzerkreuzers or Großenkreuz, in June of 1919, Von der Tann was scuttled by her crew in a final act of defiance. Eventually, the hulk was raised and scrapped in the 1930s. The efforts for a battlecruiser for the High Seas Fleet can be roughly traced back to where our story starts with Von der Tann, where the Kaiserliche Marine had been developing a response to rumors of British ships, and a quote from Gary Staff's wonderful German battlecruisers of World War I, their design, construction, and operations. Just 9 days after the meeting for the final decision about Cruiser E on May 31st, 1906, the naval attaché in London reported that the new British battlecruiser Invincible would mount a main armament of 12-inch guns. This news came at the worst conceivable moment for the Imperial Navy. The jump to the all-big-gun battleship had meant an enormous cost increase, and State Secretary Von Tirpitz was still endeavoring to incorporate this cost increase into the estimates. The only alternative appeared to be constructing Cruiser E as it had been designed. In any case, the building materials and armament had already been ordered and assembled. On February 21st, 1907, the keel of E, the Leda Blucher, was laid in the Imperial dockyard at Kiel. The next Große F would have to be designed and built in response to the newly evolved British battlecruisers. So, to sum that up, the Germans had been building the large armored cruiser Blucher in response to what they thought the British were developing, and once it became clear that the British had different plans for their battlecruisers, it was too late. The Germans would have to go back to the drawing board to create a new large cruiser. Again, taking from Staff, on May 17, 1906, 2 weeks before the first report from the London naval attaché about the British Invincible, the Kaiser launched a competition between the German shipyards for a fast battleship type. This new type crystallized the Kaiser's ideas regarding the new direction in warship construction, that these ships should form a division for special purposes and also serve as reconnaissance cruisers. Therefore, compared to foreign contemporary battleships, they should have a speed advantage of 3 knots and should mount at least 4 28cm guns so they could fight in a line. The new battleships of the Ersatz-Bayern/Nassau class should form the basis of the new type. The State Secretary of the Navy Department, Admiral Von Tirpitz, was against the idea of the competition, as it would strain the already overworked staff of the Imperial Dockyards and the Naval General Staff. Further discussions and memorandums between the different sections of the General Navy Department regarding the developments concerning the new British Invincible class and other possible threats made them come to some conclusions. The General Navy Department considered that we must build our Großenkreuz as fast battleships. The General Navy Department foresaw that for years the large cruiser of the Imperial Navy had no possibility of strategic reconnaissance and escort on a large scale, or independent cruiser warfare and merchant protection, and this would conflict with the operational objectives of the ships. The principal purpose for the ships, for now, was purely participation in decisive battles as a fast wing. This task required the displacement of a contemporary battleship and an armament that must be effective against battleships, as a confrontation between these two types was inevitable. The General Navy Department was convinced about this. Therefore, there is a fundamental disagreement between the General Navy Department and the State Secretary on the question of operational employment. Admiral Von Tirpitz saw the opponents of the large cruiser only as other cruisers. The General Navy Department had also shown remarkable insight, which proved correct in every way. As the summer carried on and discussions about the new type of ship continued either publicly or behind closed doors, shortly after September 4th, 1906, The State Secretary sent a request to the various departments and laid out his thoughts for the Großenkreuz. I request that the accelerated working through of this project for our Großenkreuz to the following criteria. A. Heavy artillery, 8 28cm, 4 in double, 4 in single turrets. B. Medium artillery, 8 to 10 15cm. C. Light artillery, as in the Großenkreuz E. D. The displacement should not exceed that of the battleship Ersatzbayern. E. The price should be below that of the Ersatzbayern. F. Speed is approximately as that of Großenkreuz E. G. Compared to Großenkreuz E, the armor should be strengthened with all means. H. If possible, turbines. The State Secretary had committed to the conceptual proposal from earlier in the summer, and with that, its inevitable consequences, such as a greater cost and defensive qualities, as the new Panzerkreuzer would have to resist 12-inch gunfire. Development of Von der Tann's eventual design developed rapidly through the summer of 1906, where again, taking from staff, so far, the development of the first German battlecruiser, the large cruiser F, had occurred in a remarkably short space of time. Not even a month had passed since the State Secretary had first instructed the construction department to implement a design utilizing 28cm guns, and the latest design variants had been created within a week. However, further changes and iterations developed for the coming year. Although I would love to delve in more into the development of Von der Tann and the other early battlecruisers, we just don't have time for that in this video, as there's so much to cover. Suffice it to say, the final design of Von der Tann was ready by late September 1907, when the construction of the large cruiser started in Hamburg. The ship displaced 19,370 tons standard displacement and 21,300 tons full load. She was powered by 18 coal-fired boilers that provided steam for 4 turbines that drove 4 screws, producing around 42,000 shaft horsepower as designed, with a maximum of 79,802 shaft horsepower. The ship was designed to have a top speed of 24.8 knots, but in actuality, it was more like 27.4 knots. The main armament of Von der Tann was 8 283mm 45 caliber or 11-inch guns and twin turrets, with 1 forward, 1 aft, and with 2 turrets on either side of the ship in echelon. The ship carried 10 150mm or 5.9-inch 45 caliber guns and casemates, 5 per side. She would also carry 16 88mm or 3.3-inch 45 caliber guns. To round out the armament, she had 4 underwater torpedo tubes. Her armor layout did vary, but her belt had a thickness ranging from 80 to 250mm or 3.1 to 9.8 inches. The armored decks varied from 50 to 80mm or 2 to 3 inches. The turrets had a face thickness of 230mm or 9 inches, and the sides and back had 180mm or 7 inches of armor. She was laid down in March of 1908, launched in March of 1909, and commissioned into the Kaiserliche Marine in September 1910. After Von der Tann completed her trials, she sailed for South America. The cruise had several purposes, the first of which was to test the ship under conditions in the open Atlantic Ocean and to gain experience of long trips in tropical climates, along with building prestige in South American nations. At 11 a.m. on February 20th, 1911, Von der Tann left Kiel and headed towards the English Channel, then taking the ship south into the Bay of Biscay, where the single freezer on the ship broke, where they were forced to stop and make immediate repairs, arriving in Tenerife on February 26th. She stayed there until the 4th of March, when she made for Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, to which she made it on the 14th of March. She was visited by dignitaries of the Brazilian government and military. Then she traveled to other parts of Brazil and on to Argentina, arriving on the 27th, staying until the 8th of April so some men could make an official trip to the capital of Buenos Aires, eventually leading her back to Santa Cruz Roads in the Canary Islands on the 27th of April. She was back at the anchorage of the High Seas Fleet by May the 6th. In her tests that were conducted, Von der Tann had very good maneuverability and motion, and her main battery remained operable under all circumstances, which was good news for the German naval staff. Her career from 1911 until the outbreak of World War I would consist of exercises with the rest of the High Seas Fleet, mostly with the developing first scouting group, and visits to other nations, including attending the fleet review at Spithead in June 1911 for the coronation of George V. The first several weeks of the Great War were relatively quiet for Von der Tann. Where things start to heat up is on the 28th of August, as at 9 a.m., the sound of gunfire could be heard from the decks of Von der Tann. Shortly after, Moltke and Von der Tann were ordered to make steam as the first Battle of Helgoland Bight was beginning, where elements of the Harwich force led by Commodore Tyrwhitt and Admiral Roger Keyes attacked German forces in Helgoland Bight, with David Beatty and his battlecruisers in support, coming close to Wilhelmshaven and the High Seas Fleet. Now, by the time Von der Tann and the rest of the first scouting group put to sea, it was far too late, as Beatty, after coming in and helping the Harwich force, beat a hasty retreat for fear of the whole High Seas Fleet coming out. But the German battlecruisers were on station to protect the smaller cruisers while they picked up survivors from the Ariadne, heading back to Wilhelmshaven that afternoon. Following some repairs in September, Von der Tann didn't have anything special come up until the 2nd of November 1914, when the 1st and 2nd scouting groups weighed anchor to conduct War Task 19. Planning would start to take shape a month earlier when Admiral von Pohl, chief of the German naval staff, and Admiral von Ingenohl, commander-in-chief of the High Seas Fleet, met on board the battleship Friedrich der Grosse to discuss the imperial decision that the German High Seas Fleet should be used defensively in the North Sea. This was to help keep the German coast protected and to free up men to go to the front, as well as to keep the Baltic under German control. However, the admirals of the High Seas Fleet did want to take offensive action. The Kaiser's decision did allow for offensive mine-laying operations on the English coast. The first attempt not going so well on October 17th, when 4 German destroyers were sunk while attempting to lay mines off the River Thames. In retaliation, the commander-in-chief of the High Seas Fleet would take advantage of the Kaiser's pronouncement that the battle fleet should avoid heavy losses. There's nothing to be said against the battlecruisers trying to damage the enemy. In these raids with the battlecruisers, if the High Seas Fleet was lucky, they might be able to lure out elements of the Grand Fleet and pick them off by carefully laid minefields and U-boats. They also thought the raids could affect the morale of both Germany and the United Kingdom, having a positive effect on the German people as their fleet attacked the English coast, while negatively affecting that of the people of the United Kingdom. The final authorization for the raid was given on October 29th, where the light cruisers were assigned to lay mines off Lowestoft and Yarmouth to disrupt coastal shipping lanes and fishing traffic, while Admiral Franz von Hipper's heavier elements would bombard Great Yarmouth. Ingenohl, in getting permission for the raid, did not tell the Kaiser that the bombardment was planned, just that the battlecruisers were there to escort the light cruisers in their mission to lay mines. With that, War Task 19, the bombardment of Great Yarmouth, began at 4 p.m. on the 2nd of November, 1914, with an eager Admiral Franz von Hipper aboard his flagship Seydlitz. The elements of the 1st and 2nd scouting groups left the Jade Estuary, with the heavier elements heading north to swing around Helgoland to avoid the patrolling British submarines, with Hipper altering course west and increasing their speed to 18 knots. At 6 p.m., 2 battle squadrons of the High Seas Fleet left to go into Helgoland Bight to provide support to this operation. On Seydlitz, Hipper did not expect much in the way of enemy naval forces, but did worry quite a bit about mines. As the German forces continued west towards England at around midnight, they encountered English fishing trawlers. Hipper feared that these were spies, and they had wireless sets to report his presence, so he would try to avoid them, but the smaller vessels were too numerous to avoid. Early in the morning on the 3rd, as the German forces approached the English coast, they found themselves in quite the conundrum, as they had approached in the dark and found themselves uncertain of their exact position. The British Admiralty had removed most of the North Sea navigation buoys and lights, but at 6:30 a.m., Seydlitz spotted a buoy that said Smith's Knoll Watch. Now knowing where they were, the German ships would steam south across Great Yarmouth Bay, preparing to bombard the town. Meanwhile, at dawn, HMS Halcyon, an elderly British destroyer, headed out of the port of Great Yarmouth into the mist of the Norfolk coast to take up her daily duty, which was to hunt for drifting mines in the coastal shipping channels. 2 other ships would soon begin their patrols off the coast. These were the 2 elderly destroyers, Lively and Leopard. These ships and 4 other destroyers comprised the defenses of Great Yarmouth, as the land fortifications, a battery of mobile 6-inch guns, had been taken to France. There were no heavy ships, as following the sinking of the 3 Cressy-class cruisers on the Broad 14s and the sinking of HMS Audacious, the nearest heavy units were the pre-dreadnoughts at Sheerness, 100 miles away. Halcyon began her daily duty and made her way northeast through the calm water with Lively and Leopard 2 miles astern. Suddenly, two unknown ships came into sight. They were both four-funnel cruisers. Halcyon attempted to signal a challenge, but would only be met by shell splashes from what turned out to be two German light cruisers, Strasbourg and Graudenz. Hipper ordered them to cease fire as he feared they were too close to British minefields, ordering only Seydlitz to fire on Halcyon. Nevertheless, a majority of the other German ships were eager to join in the fight and opened fire, as it was the gun crew's first sight of an enemy vessel. The result of this onslaught of large shells was that it smothered the small target, making accurate spotting very difficult and allowing for the little Halcyon to escape. Seeing the danger the Halcyon was in, the Lively hurriedly laid a smokescreen between her and the German forces. For around a quarter of an hour, these small vessels came under a heavy bombardment of shells. Eventually, at 7:40 a.m., Hipper realized that engaging these small ships was not what he was there to do, and that continuing his pursuit south would lead his forces into a known minefield. And while in the process, a few of the battle cruisers flung a few scattered shots towards Great Yarmouth, but they only hit the beach. When the light improved, the light cruiser Straussland finished laying a line of around 120 mines, 5 miles long in the Smith's Knoll Passage. Once out of immediate danger, Halcyon, whose radio had been damaged, had it repaired and began sending out a general warning, while Leopard, the other destroyer out on duty, signaled 2 battlecruisers and 2 armored cruisers opened fire on Lively and me. The off-duty destroyers began raising steam, with the 3 submarines E-10, D-5, and D-3 lying in Great Yarmouth Harbor began to put to sea. When out at sea, D-5 surfaced and struck a mine that was either placed by Straussland or a drifting British one, and in less than a minute, the submarine went down, taking all of the crew with her besides 2 officers and 2 men who were in the conning tower, while none of the other submarines spotted any of Hipper's ships. At 8:30, when Halcyon reached Great Yarmouth and was able to send a more accurate report that the Germans were last seen 12 miles off Lowestoft, due to the time that it took to decode and further delays, eventually the Admiralty took action at 9:55 a.m. when they ordered Admiral Beatty south with his battlecruisers and summoned the squadrons of the Grand Fleet who were in their western anchorages. By that time, Hipper was 50 miles away from the coast. Skipping ahead a bit after repairs, picket duty, and sorties, the next major operation was War Task 20, the bombardment of Scarborough, Whitby, and Hartlepool. Early on the morning of the 15th of December 1914, the 1st Scouting Group and the other scouting groups weighed anchor, and by the morning of the 16th, the 1st Scouting Group was closing in on the English coastline and split into 2 groups, with Seydlitz, Moltke, and Blücher going north to bombard Hartlepool, while Deflinge and Von der Tann went south to Scarborough, opening fire on the town at 9:05 and continued to fire until 9:23, where they headed to Whitby, and again, like at Scarborough, they closed to 1 nautical mile offshore and at 10:06 opened fire, where Corvette and Capitaine Marholtz lamented, "Even if these coastal bombardments only had the destruction of certain military targets as their secondary objective, then one should make preparations for the secondary aim. In this case, the attacks over illegitimacy and cruelty of such a bombardment, baby killers, could have been calmly avoided." A short time later, the northern group came south to rendezvous with Deflinge and Von der Tann to head towards the German Bight. However, they were followed by a British force, including the British battlecruisers. The German battlecruisers steered to avoid battle across the North Sea and passed east of Helgoland en route to the Jade, arriving on the 17th. The remainder of December saw Von der Tann in docks for repairs, where she would be in late January, meaning that Von der Tann missed the Battle of Dogger Bank. The next several months for Von der Tann weren't very interesting, as they consisted of the typical repairs, picket duty, sorties, and drill we often discuss with German Panzerkreuzes. Things started to pick back up in early August, when Von der Tann and other elements of the 1st Scouting Group were deployed in the Baltic to assist in an attempt to break into the Gulf of Riga. The 1st Scouting Group was to occupy a supporting position if the Russian fleet should attempt to intervene against this, wherein the battlecruisers were to engage the Russian dreadnoughts, these being the battleships of the Ganget class. Moltke, Seydlitz, and Von der Tann arrived off the Gulf of Riga on August 8th and zigzagged their way around for over a week, waiting for the Russian fleet to come out, which they never would. As the battlecruisers steered around the Baltic islands, Von der Tann was given the order to bombard one island on the 10th, where early that morning the Coburg reported a large armored cruiser near the island, this being the Bayern. Shortly after, Von der Tann approached the island Uto and turned to port to give broadside to open fire on the Russian guns, where Von der Tann fired at Russian ships, including the Bayan, Russian guns on the island, and submarines. Von der Tann received a hit from the Russian guns on the lower part of the forward funnel. The submarines caused Von der Tann to do evasive maneuvers. After having fired close to 150 rounds of ammunition and causing little damage to the Russian guns, Von der Tann retired and headed towards what today is Gdynia. She was there until the 15th, when she put out into the Baltic once again to support operations against the Gulf of Riga. These were cut short on the 19th, when the British submarine E-1 torpedoed SMS Moltke, something I would have covered in a revised video on Moltke that would have been out already. However, it was lost due to some technical errors. Always back up your files. Anyway, the first scouting group escorted Moltke back to Gdynia. The remaining battlecruisers continued the operation, eventually returning to Kiel by the 28th. The remainder of the year followed the same routine we discussed earlier. The year 1916 opened up with the typical rotation we discussed when it comes to German battlecruisers, alternating between picket duty and shilling roads, the occasional sortie, and of course repairs in the various dockyards. This time, in January 1916, it was just usual fitting out. Also in January, a new commander-in-chief was appointed to the command of the High Seas Fleet, this being Admiral Reinhard Scheer, who would have a more aggressive posture than his predecessor. Still, Von der Tann was in dry dock for a short period, then doing some minor mining operations, until she helped escort the merchant raider Mauve home in early March. The next large-scale fleet action was another advance on the English coastline in late April, where on the 24th, the first scouting group raised anchor and put to sea, with Seydlitz striking a mine later that day. After that, the remaining ships were ordered to carry out the bombardment. The ships came upon the English coastline early the next morning, taking Great Yarmouth and Lowestoft under fire. The Germans were met by 2 light cruisers and 8 destroyers, causing the first scouting group to turn and change course. In the process, the group was attacked by aircraft that were taken under fire by flak from the ships. The ships returned to Germany at high speeds. The return trip was uneventful for Von der Tann, as was the remainder of May, up until the 31st with the Battle of Jutland. At 3 a.m. on Wednesday the 31st of May, per Operational Order 6, Lützow with Hipper on board weighed anchor and led the German scouting groups into the North Sea. Things were relatively quiet for Von der Tann at the rear of the line behind Lützow, the new flagship, De Flinge, Seydlitz, and Moltke. The first scouting group continued to push into the North Sea until 3:20, when the cruiser Elbing reported smoke from the southwest. By 4:20, the first scouting group increased speed to 25 knots to catch what turned out to be British light cruisers. Just 3 minutes later, British battlecruisers were spotted, these being the 1st and 2nd battlecruiser squadrons under the command of Admiral David Beatty. At 4:30, after observing the British movements, Hipper understood that Beatty intended to cut him off from his home base, and accordingly turned on a southeasterly course as to appear to be in full retreat back to the Jade. There was a debate on the flagship beforehand that I want to share, as I have a new book from Gary Staff, Skagerrak, The Battle of Jutland Through German Eyes, where an officer after the fact wrote, "High tension dominates with all the crew, as after scarcely 1 hour after sighting British light forces, smoke clouds and heavy mast of ships climb over the horizon. I hear more as Admiral Hipper up at the Admiral's Bridge said to his chief of staff in his Bavarian dialect, 'Rada, I'll eat my broomstick if that's not Beatty again.' Yes, that is the future Admiral Rada whom Hipper is talking to." Another interesting quote comes from another German officer, Korvettenkapitän Marholtz, Von der Tann's first artillery officer, writing, "It dawned on some that the battle was beginning, but probably no one supposed the entire English fleet was on the spot. While we steered on a new course, the English admiral formed a line on course south and stated his intention of cutting off our Panzerkreuz from our line of retreat. Admiral Hipper followed this movement and gave the best opportunity of drawing enemy forces onto our main body to the south, and now 2 enemy columns neared one another with a converging course. At 4:48 p.m., as Beatty closed the range even further, Hipper stood on the bridge of Lützow calmly smoking a cigar, giving the order to open fire, upon which the thunderous roar of the German guns opened up the Battle of Jutland. The first few moments are described by De Flinge's gunnery officer George Hasse in Castles of Steel, Britain, Germany, in the Winning of the Great War at Sea by Robert K. Massey. Hasse writes, "The 6 ships which had been proceeding in 2 columns formed a single line ahead, like a herd of prehistoric monsters. They closed on one another with slow movements, spectre-like, irresistible. At the last, there was a dull roar. The Lutzo is firing her first salvo, and immediately the signal, "Open fire," is hoisted. In the same second, I shout, "Salvos fire," and the thunder of our first salvo crashes out. Fire distribution was an issue for Beatty, as he intended for Lion and Princess Royal to fire on the leading German ship Lutzo, while the other ships followed along down the line, with Queen Mary firing on Deflinga, Taiga on Seydlitz, New Zealand on Moltke, and Indefatigable on Von der Tann. Lion and Princess Royal fired on Lutzo as they should have done, but Queen Mary fired on Seydlitz, leaving Deflinga unmolested. However, on the German side, Von der Tann and Indefatigable were beginning their duel at the rear of the line, the two oldest battlecruisers currently engaged in the battle, and a battle it was. Marholtz writes, "For a long time I occupied my post on the direction indicator periscope and directed my battery and rangefinders on the enemy, which was magnified 15 times through my glasses, and I could make out the enemy ships. Fire distribution from left the signalman called through the armored slit, and I slowly counted along the enemy line through my periscope. The loading of the guns had been ordered some while before in the turrets. The men had shoved armor-piercing rounds into the barrels, on which a not-too-friendly greeting for the English had been written in chalk. The adjusted range was 162 hectometers, and then finally came the release. Open fire. And at the same second, the first salvo crashed out against the enemy. Almost at the same time, one saw the clear muzzle flash and the spiraling yellow-brown smoke cloud climb over the ship. Accurately, the middle of the 16th Division of the direction indicator lay under the middle funnel of the battlecruiser Indefatigable, the name of which I did not know at the time, only recognizing the type. Von der Tann opened fire at 4:49, 1 minute after Lutzo had opened fire, and Von der Tann's firing was good, where Marholtz writes again, "I guarded myself against observing hits, and adhered strictly to observing the fall of shot. My young lieutenant in the mast also reported a hit. Straddling good rapid followed the order after the impact, and salvos now followed in brief intervals, salvos following salvos into the air. The enemy fired slowly. You could see the flash of their salvos, and those who had time could use a stopwatch to determine the enemy fall of shot near the ship. Still, the enemy did not shoot well, and many salvos came nowhere near the target. Probably over there they had poorer visibility than us. Our light ship color made it difficult in the hazy weather. Meanwhile, the fire of Von der Tann was extraordinarily successful. The enemy sometimes disappeared completely in the surrounding columns of water. As Indefatigable was so covered, seemingly she ceased fire and attempted to withdraw from the deadly fire by a zigzag course, but thanks to the good glasses, each movement could be recognized. Von der Tann was putting out withering and increasingly accurate fire against Indefatigable, and at 5:03 it was observed that Indefatigable was struck by 2 or 3 shells from one salvo, and in Nick Jellicoe's Jutland the Unfinished Battle he writes, "Finally, at 5:02 p.m. at a range of 16,000 yards, the German shells tore through the thin plating just above the armored belt by X turret and exploded in the magazine. A second salvo hit A turret and may have caused a cordite fire. 30 seconds after the superstructure was hit, a ripple of fire seemed to race from the bows right the way back down the 19,000-ton battlecruiser as her magazine exploded. Only 14 minutes after opening fire did Indefatigable go down. All of her crew except for 2 went down with the ship. The loss of Indefatigable was captured by a navigating officer looking back at the ship. We were altering course to port at the time, and it seemed as if her steering was damaged, as she did not follow around in our wake, but held on until she was about 500 yards on her starboard quarter. While we were looking at her, she was hit again by 2 shells, one on the forecastle and one on the fore turret. Both shells appeared to explode on impact. There was about 30 seconds, and then the ship completely blew up. The main explosion started with sheets of flame, followed immediately by a dense dark smoke cloud that obscured the ship from view. All sorts of stuff was blown up into the air. A 50-foot picket boat being blown up about 200 feet, apparently intact though upside down. One last quote about the Indefatigable's loss, this time from Marholtz. Then, 14 minutes after opening fire, the enemy was fatally damaged. In the direction indicator periscope, briefly after the impact of a salvo, I saw a giant explosion in the aft gun turret. A bright flash flame, and ship's debris was thrown in a wide arc through the air. Seemingly, it was the turret roof, which, through the pressure of the explosion inside, had been lifted off. The next salvo gave the ship the rest. It hit further forward, and soon after the impact, a tremendous black smoke cloud climbed from the ship, reaching double the mast height, and the enemy ship disappeared. Probably an oil bunker was hit and burning. For the sake of certainty, another salvo was fired into the smoke cloud, but scarcely would have reached the target that had already vanished into the waves. Although the auxiliary observation officer was certain that the enemy had sunk, I was skeptical because I knew from experience just how easily at this range one can be mistaken. People often see what they want to see. Only after the smoke had cleared and nothing was to be seen, and the other officer assured me again and again, did I allow myself to be convinced and report the success to the commander. Below decks, the news that the enemy had been blown up spread like wildfire, and in my headphones I could hear the cheers of the men. With the destruction of Indefatigable, Von der Tann switched her fire to HMS New Zealand with little success, with one hit achieved at 5:26. And as the battle developed at 5:26, while being fired on by Deflinge and Zeidlitz, Queen Mary exploded in a similar manner. Following the destruction of the two British battlecruisers and the near-fatal damage to Lion, BD reversed course, and the run to the south ended, and now the run to the north began. The first scouting group ran into the oncoming 5th Battle Squadron of Queen Elizabeth-class battleships under the command of Rear Admiral Hugh Evan Thomas, who began engaging the oncoming ships of the first scouting group and eventually the High Seas Fleet as Sheer came into view. Before that, Evan Thomas's flagship Barham began opening fire on the last ship in the German line with 15-inch guns, and at 5:09, remember I'm using the German time for the battle, Von der Tann received her first hit. Being hit in compartment 1, slightly below the waterline, the explosion caused the ship to violently whip up and down 6 or 7 times, and eventually allowed 600 tons of water to enter the ship. While pursuing the 5th Battle Squadron and the remaining battlecruisers, Von der Tann was fired on by Barham, achieving 1 hit and then again shifting fire to New Zealand. In a rare case, shortly after 5:20, Von der Tann was struck by a 13.5-inch shell from HMS Tiger that jammed A turret, and only a short time later, another shell from Tiger effectively jammed C turret, and in just a short period of time, Tiger had taken out 2 of Von der Tann's turrets, and in effect, having the ship's ability to fight. Von der Tann continued to chase the British battlecruisers and fire on them, where, at 5:37, both guns from B turret failed to run out after recoiling, as they had wedged in the gun cradle because of overheating, meaning that 3/4 of Von der Tann's turrets could no longer fire. Just before 6 p.m., the run to the north came to a close, and at around 5:55, BD's battlecruisers came into view of the Commander-in-Chief of the Grand Fleet, Admiral Jellicoe. Von der Tann was coming under increasingly heavy fire from the British 1st and 2nd Battlecruiser squadrons, and soon enough the 3rd Battlecruiser squadron to the northeast. Still, because of poor visibility, Von der Tann was unable to respond. As visibility cleared, cruisers and destroyers were spotted just after 6, causing the first scouting group to turn south and then southwest. From 6:10, the first scouting group turned to starboard, back on a northeasterly course, and an enemy cruiser was immediately spotted and taken under fire from Lutzow, this being HMS Defense. There were uncertainties aboard other ships of the first scouting group as to the ship's identity, which delayed opening fire. Von der Tann continued in the fight with the 1st Battlecruiser Squadron and the movements of the 1st Scouting Group as the Battle of Jutland developed, as Deflinge and Lutzow destroyed HMS Invincible. Before that, Von der Tann's last remaining turret, Turret D, failed to run out shortly after one another. Now, Von der Tann had no heavy artillery capable of engaging the enemy, but Captain Zanka held his ship in line to draw the enemy fire and prevent the British from doubling up on one another's ships. Following the movements of the 1st Scouting Group leads us to a little past 8 p.m., where D turret was functional again. As the two sides dueled, Von der Tann and the other battlecruisers were ordered against the oncoming Grand Fleet, being given the order, "Battlecruisers at the enemy, give it everything." Massey says, "The charge of the German battlecruisers has come to be called a death ride. Although Lutzow was out of action, and the other 4 German battlecruisers were heavily damaged, Deflinge's Captain Hartog led the squadron at 20 knots towards the British line. 2 of the ships were scarcely more than battered hulls, filled with thousands of tons of salt water, the sea rolling over their bows up to the forward turrets, more than half their guns destroyed or out of action, their compartments filled with dead and dying men. Yet they drove forward." Von der Tann now and beforehand was under heavy fire from British ships, including the 15-inch guns of HMS Revenge, killing men who were working on fixing the turrets to try to get Von der Tann back in the fight. Also, staff writes, "From a German perspective, there was no death ride. No headlong charge of the Light Brigade by the 1st Scouting Group into the maw of the enemy line, but instead there was, in fact, a considered turn to the south to engage the enemy that was for the most part invisible. There were several pauses in the battle, with one lasting approximately until 9:20. Just beforehand, Hipper came alongside to see if the battlecruiser would make an appropriate flagship. As I mentioned previously, Lutzow was damaged and would eventually sink with some help from German destroyers. At 9:20, when the British battlecruisers opened fire again on the 1st Scouting Group, the ships returned fire, but it was sporadic as visibility was poor. The fighting against Beatty's battlecruisers soon came to a close, where staff writes, "Since Von der Tann could make no more than 18 knots and had to clean her fires, she attached the end of the German line during the night, behind the 2nd Squadron and with Der Flinge behind. At 3:12, a powerful explosion was observed, the destruction of Pommern. At 3:27, the wreck was passed. A short time later, at 3:42, a torpedo track was recognized at port, and Von der Tann sheered out of line to starboard. At 2:02 on June 1st, Von der Tann passed the outer Jade, light vessel A, and at 2:50 anchored at Wilhelmshaven Roads. Then at 5:15 ran into the southern harbor at Wilhelmshaven. During the battle, Von der Tann had suffered 11 dead, 4 badly wounded, and 31 slightly wounded. Von der Tann suffered 4 rather serious hits during the Battle of Jutland, which this graphic does an excellent job illustrating. The repairs took until mid-August, and an interesting point is that to effect the repairs on A turret, the battleship Rhineland's D turret was cannibalized to effect those repairs. Von der Tann wasn't back up in action until October 1916, where on the 15th, the position of 2 admirals for the 1st Scouting Group was reinstated for the first time since August 1914, and Vice Admiral Bodecker made his flagship Von der Tann, which served as his flagship until the end of the war, which, unfortunately for us, the remainder of 1916 was again not that interesting, returning to the routine of repairs, picket duty, and sorties. Now, for the sake of time plus my sanity and yours, the remainder of the war follows along the same theme as many of the other Panzerkreuzes we have discussed. Say it with me now: repairs, picket duty, and sorties. One last attempt occurred on the 30th of October 1918, where she ran out into Schilling Roads, ready for an impending operation, where Von der Tann and the other ships of the High Seas Fleet were to fight one last battle. This was to be the death ride of the High Seas Fleet. The operation was meant to lure out the Grand Fleet from Scapa Flow and use all available means at the disposal of the High Seas Fleet to destroy the Grand Fleet. Admiral Reinhard Scheer, who had led the German fleet at Jutland, now promoted, approved Hipper's plan, as both admirals hoped that, in addition to salvaging the honor of the German Navy, a tactical success might revert the military position and avert surrender. This was not to be, as the admirals had not taken into consideration the war weariness and defeatism of their sailors, who didn't necessarily want to die in an all-out battle that most likely would not have changed the outcome of the war. In the ensuing mutiny, Hipper had to call off the operation, and by this point, the armistice was less than 2 weeks away. On November 19th, Von der Tann was part of the group of interned ships that was transferred to Britain under the command of Vice Admiral Reuter. On June 21st, 1919, the large cruiser was sunk by her crew in Scapa Flow. She was later salvaged and scrapped by the British in 1930. I'll close out with one of the first quotes from staff I used when discussing her design. The General Navy Department considered that we must build our Großenkreuzer as fast battleships. The General Navy Department foresaw that for years the large cruiser of the Imperial Navy had no possibility of strategic reconnaissance and escort on a large scale, or independent cruiser warfare and merchant protection, and this would conflict with the operational objectives of the ships. The principal purpose for the ships, for now, was purely participation in decisive battles as a fast wing. This task required the displacement of a contemporary battleship and an armament that must be effective against battleships, as a confrontation between the two types was inevitable. The General Navy Department was convinced about this. Therefore, there is a fundamental disagreement between the General Navy Department and the State Secretary on the question of operational employment. Admiral von Tirpitz saw the opponents of the large cruisers only as other cruisers. The General Navy Department had also shown remarkable insight, which was proved correct in every way. Thank you all for watching, and please remember to like and subscribe as it'll help the channel to grow. Until next time, my friends, have a great week.